Good morning. I'm Qualle, Interim Director of the California Water Institute, and on behalf of the CWI and staff, I welcome you to Day 2 of the Funding Water Infrastructure Summit. Yesterday, Amber Crowell explained to us how poverty rates and agricultural production are inversely connected, with high agricultural rates producing low poverty rates in the valley, and vice versa. Then David Sunday took us through the economic impacts that a reduced water supply will have on agricultural production rates and our economy in the valley. We call this the do-nothing solution. Our last speaker yesterday was Scott Hamilton. Scott presented a solution to ensure adequate water supply for the valley into the future with a price tag of $7 to $9 billion. And that's a staggering amount of money that will require all of us to collaborate on in order to realize it. Today's speakers will share with us their vision for how to fund and manage the implementation of the projects we need to ensure an adequate water supply for our valley into the future. Thanks for coming today, and now Laura will take over, share with us the logistics for today, and present our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Codie, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Yesterday was a very active day on the Slack workspace, and we hope you continue to interact there and ask questions. We will encourage today's speakers to join Slack and answer some questions after their presentation. We realize that some questions did not get answered yesterday and want to remind you that tomorrow's is a panel discussion and some of the questions might be addressed there. And lastly, the CWI team will follow up with information to make sure that all of your questions were answered. Publications related to the presentations will be available on Slack, but the PowerPoints and recordings will be available on the CWI website in a few days. Recordings are available on the location you joined the live stream as shown on the screen about an hour after each of the days. A few things about the live stream. The live stream video has a minute lag time and questions are being provided to me. So please do not wait until the end of the presentation to submit your questions on Slack. As they come to your mind, please place them in there. We hope you have enjoyed the discussion on the Slack workspace. If you have not joined, let me do a quick run through. General event questions or general questions about water should be addressed in the general channel. Technical support questions should go into the technical support channel, and please direct any questions specific to the presentation in the tab dedicated to each of the presentations. I just want to remind everyone that all message posted on the channels are public. If you need to send a private message to the CWI team, please do so as a direct IM in that section. We will have a few minutes breaks after each presentation to give you time to get up and walk around if you need to. If a presentation ends early or later, we will adjust the time of the break to stay on schedule. Yesterday, Scott Hamilton told us what the projects for the do something scenario can be and what they would cost. Today's first speaker, Hanak, will tell us about some of the ways we have traditionally funded, how we traditionally approach funding infrastructure investments in California. Ellen, we will give you control of the screen. Just click once to accept the control, and from there, click to move the PowerPoint to the next slide. Ellen?
Great. Good morning, and thank you, Laura, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody at Fresno State at the California Water Institute for organizing this and for including me. I'm excited to be with you today. I changed my title a little bit, Tommy and Laura, because I thought, I know Tommy was hoping I would talk about some sort of the way we traditionally fund infrastructure in California and what that means for the valley. And I thought it might be good to situate it a little bit in the context of some of the broader work that we've also been doing on the valley, especially given kind of what you heard yesterday from both from David Sunding and from Scott Hamilton. They both kind of refer to some of the work that PBIC has been doing. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of that as well. So I'm going to just quickly give you a little bit on our take on SGMA challenges and solutions for the Valley. As many of you know, we've been working in the Valley with a large team and engaging with a lot of stakeholders for 4 or 5 years now. And so there's just going to be some high level results from that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key funding needs that these SGMA related challenges present, and then some possible funding sources. So that's kind of going to get us to the, how do we normally fund infrastructure in California and how can we think about this? And hopefully that's going to set Tommy up really well for his presentation. So first, here's a map that you've seen various versions of this already. This is the main groundwater basins that are going to be where people use groundwater both for farming and for drinking water and industrial uses. And the big oblong circle there is the San Joaquin Valley region. Most of it is colored in orange. That's because those are what the Department of Water Resources has considered critically overdrafted basins. Those are the basins that had the tightest timeline for complying with SGMA and getting groundwater sustainability plans in. So just, we've been talking as we talk about sort of SGMA and the San Joaquin Valley, that this region is really at ground zero for implementing SGMA. It's the largest ag region in the state with more than 50% of agricultural output. That's been true for quite a long time. It's also got the biggest imbalance in groundwater with sort of the largest estimated overdraft. We estimate that it's about 2 million acre feet per year on average, more in very dry years. There are some years, David showed you yesterday, one of our charts showing that there are some years where there is a net recharge. On average, we estimate over the last 30 years that this is about 11% of net water use. And that means the water that's consumed by crops and evaporated into the atmosphere. The consequences of overdraft really hit home in this region during the last drought, when there was a lot of pumping because there was so little surface water, dry wells. This especially impacted shallow drinking water wells, domestic wells, and small community wells, but also a number of ag wells that went dry or were coming up short. Sinking lands, big issue in much of the region. It's been a sort of historically an issue in the Valley when people pump too much in certain areas relative to the amount of recharge. And what we started to see in a big way was big drops in major regional infrastructure like the Bryant Current Canal, California Aqueduct, Delta Mendota Canal, along with some smaller infrastructure affecting all kinds of things, including flood structures, bridges, what have you. So, the first plans have been submitted for all of for the 11 basins in the Valley that are considered critically overdrafted. That's all but Tracy, Modesto, Turlock, and a small one down at the bottom of the Valley. I'm going to show you a little bit about sort of some takeaways from that. I just want to sort of first start though by saying, if you think about SGMA at the really high level for the Valley, there are kind of two problems. One is a groundwater math problem. In order to bring the basins into balance, you either need to have more supplies or you need to use less water or some combination of the two. And that is kind of what's been on people's minds as they've been doing the groundwater sustainability planning. It's been on the minds of the folks involved in the blueprint exercise. And then the other piece of it is the economics problem. And this is kind of at the key of both the supply and the demand side. Some solutions to this groundwater math problem are more costly than others. And just to kind of give you a sense of where our work falls in relation to sort of some of the things that you heard yesterday, I'd say that on the economics problem, which is kind of what David's talk was about, our studies do a lot of the same kind of thing in the sense of trying to look at what happens if you if you have to go on a big groundwater diet in the Valley. His scenario is a bit more pessimistic than ours. He looks at a bigger decline in required decline in water use. But these are roughly sort of situations of looking at a worst case scenario where there's really inflexible use of water, and there's not trading, and there's no new supplies. So that's kind of the worst case scenario, where you assume nobody's going to be adapting or adjusting in the economy. So we're a little bit less pessimistic on that, because we looked at the options for a slightly lower amount of overdraft. We also looked at some options for flexibility that David hasn't yet done in his work. I think he's looking into some of those things now in a next phase. On the supply side, we are probably a little more pessimistic than what Scott presented to you. We looked at all of the range of options that had already been kind of penciled out, with amounts of potential water supply that could be made available, as well as what they would cost. We found that there was a lot of potential water available, but some of it was pretty expensive. And so what we assume based on our analysis is that maybe about a quarter of this deficit could be met cost effectively at a price that farmers would be able to afford. And that's a key sort of thing in thinking about farmers making the decision between whether they want to pay for new supplies, or whether they would prefer to reduce their water use, and kind of what pencils out more for their ag business. So I'm going to just show you quickly kind of what that looks like. I'm not going to go into the details of this. You can find it you'll have the slides, and you can find it in the references I'm giving you. But basically, we looked at what happens with inflexible water use. That's the brown. What happens with local water trading? That's the orange. What happens with valley-wide surface water trading? That is the yellow. And what happens when you also add in the cost-effective new supplies? That's the blue. And you get dramatic reductions in the cost to the local economy if you have flexible water use and trading, including surface water and groundwater trading done responsibly. Of course, it has to be done in a careful way. That's important for revenue losses, for local GDP losses, for farm-related job losses. Where you really get an impact on changes in land fallowing is when you add in new supplies. And that's because irrigation efficiency it does a lot of great things in the valley, but it doesn't really solve this groundwater math problem, because most irrigation efficiency is just allowing you to stretch the same water over more fields, but it doesn't actually change how much water the crops consume. So for really reducing how much the crops consume, you're mostly going to have to be fallowing land. So that's kind of the big picture on the economics and the groundwater. I just want to show you these maps to kind of make it feel a little bit more real in terms of why we've been emphasizing a lot the message that regional cooperation and thinking flexibly, both about where the new supplies are going to come in, and where and why trading and sort of flexible demand management is important, is when you look at sort of where's their water right now and where are the crops. So the map on the left, the all cropland, that shows you irrigated crop acreage in 2016, and it's looking at the average surface water that was available in those areas over the 2001 to 2015 period. So, kind of an average, including wet years and dry years and kind of normal years. And anything that is bright red is basically groundwater only lands. Anything that is dark blue is in good shape. Things that are, in light blue are still in very good shape, probably don't need to use groundwater. Anything that's in orange or light red is having to use groundwater at least some of the time, and it gives you a sense of sort of who's going to be vulnerable if you just make very inflexible cuts in groundwater pumping. And we broke it out into perennials and annuals just to sort of show, because as folks know, an annual crop has a little more flexibility in terms of you don't need to water it every year. If it's a really bad water year, you can fallow it without losing massive investments. That's not true for perennials. And what you can see is that the valley has a lot of perennials. That's been a trend of growth really in most of the region over the last few decades. And there's a lot of perennials that are in the groundwater only lands with the bright red there. So that's where, if you really make rigid cuts in groundwater availability and you don't think about how to get water to the most productive lands, it's going to be a big economic hit, much bigger economic hit for the region than if there's flexibility and cooperation and thoughts about how to make investments that are going to be able to get water to the most productive lands. So now, just I mentioned we did a, the new groundwater sustainability plans are in. We did a review looking at kind of what those plans say for the valley. So there were, I think, 36 plans that were submitted for the 11 critically overdrafted basins. We have a blog series on this that came out this past spring, and we also submitted comments to the Department of Water Resources about this. That's what I've listed here as the source. You can find that on our website online. There's also an event that we did back in May with an hour-long video presenting this and with some good discussion, good questions that we got from the audience. This picture is just highlighting for you what the plans say about how they're planning to end overdraft. And this is for 10 of the basins, because in the Merced Basin, there were projects and actions listed, but they didn't actually put numbers of how many acre feet they expected to get out of them. So this is for the other 10 critically overdrafted basins. And there are a few messages that are important takeaways for people to note. One is that you can just see that total amount there at the bottom, a bit over 2,241,000 acre feet a year. That suggests that, in principle, the plans are providing enough solutions to address their overdraft problems. So that part is good. The challenge that we identified is that folks are double and triple and maybe even quadruple counting the drops of water. There's a lot of emphasis on the supply side, not so much emphasis on the demand side, and the plans really reflect a lot of local actions that, when you pull them together at the regional level, they don't add up. And so I'll just walk you through really quickly what I mean by that. You see that there are three big color codes here. There's a sort of greenish blue, there's a sort of yellow orange, and then there's a reddish orange. So the greenish blue part, that's what we call augmenting supplies. And these are projects that are aiming to capture additional flood flows, in particular, mostly from within the region. There's not much in any of these plans that is counting on bringing more water in from the Sacramento Valley. So it's mainly about capturing additional flood flows within the region, plus some reclaimed water and a bit of surface storage as well, mostly groundwater recharge. You can see almost 1 million acre feet. And we identified also in our work, based on looking at all the studies that were out there, that recharge is the most cost-effective and promising new source for augmenting water supplies in this region. But this number is big relative to what's likely to be available, certainly in relation to flood flows that are available from the valley's own rivers. Now, what Scott showed you yesterday was really a different kind of idea of capturing additional flood flows from the Sacramento Valley, which means they have to come through the Delta, no matter what you do. And I would say that's an interesting idea that's worth scoping more. As he highlighted, that's still a pretty high level analysis, and it doesn't really have doesn't have as much ground truthing yet on what would be actually feasible from a regulatory and infrastructure and cost perspective. So then the next little group there, the yellow, that's surface water, shifting surface water use is what we call it. These are actions that for any individual groundwater sustainability planning area, this would increase their surface water, but it's mainly by taking surface water that's already being used somewhere else by somebody else. And so at a regional level, the plans don't reflect that water would come out of someplace else, I guess is the way to think about it. So this is surface water trading, across groundwater sustainability planning areas within the valley for the most part. Surface water treatment, that is cities that are planning on getting more off of groundwater and onto surface water by treating surface water. Sometimes they already have the rights to it. Sometimes but somebody else is using it right now. Sometimes they expect that they're going to get it in some way, maybe through, flood flows and so on. Conveyance, that's extending conveyance to groundwater areas so that you could get surface water to them. Again, that surface water, it's not like there's a lot of spare surface water that's not already claimed. And so that would typically involve shifting surface water, same with recycled water. And then this little orange sliver here, this is the explicit managing demand part of the plans right now. It's only about 20%. And I'll just say that, I know a lot of the basins didn't want to focus on this first. They wanted to sort of go out of the gate looking at all the options they had on the supply side, and that makes a lot of sense. But I think a lot of folks recognize that it's going to be important to think about doing the demand management part of SGMA in a smart way and providing incentives so that we don't get to the really inflexible, high cost ways of managing demand, that we give water users flexibility to kind of move that around so that the water can go to the most productive lands. So now I want to just talk a little bit about what we kind of identify as kind of, if I think about sort of SGMA, what this means for water infrastructure and funding needs in the Valley, kind of three big areas. The first, and this is what, kind of goes to what Scott was talking about, and I think what Tommy's probably going to be talking about in terms of thinking about funding solutions, is there's going to be a need to address water, the big water supply infrastructure. And so I'm calling it here fixing existing water infrastructure and making smart new investments. And Scott was really talking about the making smart new investments. Where do we need to think about conveyance that can help with recharge? I would say conveyance is important also for some of the water trading that I talked about. And when we think about conveyance, it's not just the big stuff, it's also the more local stuff. Anything that's big stuff, really you need to think about a regional approach to it in terms of planning for it and funding it. But I also want to highlight that there's a fixed existing water infrastructure part, and that has to do with the significant land subsidence that has occurred in places for some of the key infrastructure. Folks are aware of the issues on the Bryant Canal, which have already significantly reduced the capacity of this canal to get water down to these very dry areas down here. California Aqueduct has issues too, Delta Mendota, and so on. And what this map on this side shows you is that the plans that were submitted actually are going to allow potentially a lot of additional land subsidence. So this is one of those undesirable effects that they have to address. And our sense, based on our review of the plans, is that there's still work in progress on this, and there's going to be a need to really think smartly about, where does it make sense to put new infrastructure investments? How do we do it? But how do we also safeguard so that pumping is not just undermining those investments over a short space of time? So funding need number two, and this one, from a sort of dollar perspective, this is going to be not as big probably as the first one that I mentioned, but this is really a very urgent issue in the Valley that has been on the radar for a while. And I would say even if we didn't have SGMA, we would have to be thinking about this in an urgent way. This is addressing drinking water access and quality issues in the Valley. I'm showing you here two maps. The one on the map labeled A, this is water quality. This shows small water systems that were out of compliance with different kinds of pollutants. This was as of, I think, summer 2018. And the dots change a little bit depending on what your, any particular month, but it gives you a rough idea. And we've got the San Joaquin Valley counties highlighted there. The Valley's a hotspot, not only for SGMA, it's also a hotspot for these issues. A lot of different community systems have water quality contaminants. Many domestic wells that are not shown on here also do. This is a priority for the state to be addressing. There are some funds, state funds, some federal funds that can help address this, but this is also an area where there's probably going to need to be some ongoing local contributions to this, especially since there are ongoing contributions to the problem, especially when it comes to nitrate. And this is part of a different regulatory process from SGMA, the salt and nitrate control plan, but it's something that really, you know, the ag folks are going to need to be partners, and I would say urbans need to be good partners in this work too. And then this map B, this shows you what happened during the last drought in terms of water systems and households facing shortages because of dry wells or wells that were almost, you know, that were not functioning well. And under SGMA, this is going to be an important thing to address, which is one of the undesirable results of SGMA that the plans have to guard against is unreasonable declines in groundwater levels that could have significant and unreasonable undesirable results. And domestic wells going dry is definitely in that category. And you can see in our review of the groundwater sustainability plans that there are some basins that are just not addressing this effectively yet. There's been some other work done by environmental justice groups and the Water Foundation that does some modeling work on this that shows some real potential problems here. So there's going to be a need to either avoid those pumping impacts altogether by reducing pumping and addressing recharge specifically in areas where there are wells, or there's going to be a need to mitigate it through other solutions like getting folks onto alternative water supplies. And that's going to entail some costs. And I would say that part is not explicitly a part of the state's funding for safe drinking water. This is really a responsibility of the groundwater sustainability plans and the GSAs. Number 3, just thinking back to demand management, that's going to have to be a part of the solution in the Valley, is thinking about how to steward idled lands in ways that are going to generate value and avoid negative impacts in the Valley. And, you know, this is kind of about how to make lemonade out of lemons, I guess is, you know, one way to think about it. David in his talk talked about, you know, the importance of thinking about stewarding lands and really thinking about the challenges of managing lands that are going to come out of production. Scott talked about that some too. I think, you know, even if the Valley is successful in bringing in more supplies than we anticipate is going to be likely or cost effective, there's going to be some land coming out of production. This little circle donut chart shows you our estimates of kind of the low bound estimates. We estimate that with cost effective supplies coming into the Valley, there's still going to be a bit over 500,000 acres of irrigated cropland coming out of production. And what we're showing you here are some of the potential uses of these lands, and that includes sort of some habitat kind of focused things. That's the bright orange, San Joaquin desert habitat, intermittent wetlands, riparian corridors. Those are things where there have already been some investments and there's potential for more. The big purple slice is a bigger slice than we had in our last report, actually, because the Nature Conservancy came out with a report in last summer, showing that actually the Valley is a really good place for cost-effective utility scale solar. And if California continues to up its game in terms of its goals on electrification by 2050, this is, you know, how much acreage could be put into solar in a cost-effective way as part of that electrification strategy. And then the yellow is, we're just calling it other idle land. This is land that's going to have to be used for something productively. And the risk of not doing this in a careful way and thought out way is that if you're just kind of managing the lands in a haphazard way and just tilling them to avoid pests, you have dust risks, you're losing carbon, you know, the soil health is going down. If they're just left kind of as weeds, you're causing pest problems, wildfire risks. And there are actually a lot of possible uses of lands that could generate benefit and improve soil health in kind of in a rotational way. So this is going to be a challenge for the Valley, and incentives are going to be an important part of that in terms of thinking about how to do it. So possible funding sources, just to kind of bring you to, thinking about how we pay for some of this stuff. First, as a reminder, people often think of federal and state dollars as, the solution to a funding gap. And just want to remind folks that most of what we spend on our water system in California is from local dollars. We've broken this out. This is across all of California water system spending. The local is that dark blue, about 85%. The state, usually comes in in any given year at 10 to 12%. The feds 3 to 4%. And the federal dollars, we may be looking at a boost if there's infrastructure money coming as part of the economic recovery right now, but that's still not going to be a huge windfall, and it's going to have to be for shovel-ready projects. So not the kinds of things that will take 20 years to build. I think thinking about the local side of things, a lot of this comes from water users and wastewater customers. Some of it's through their bills. Most water infrastructure is paid for by water users. That's been true for almost everything in California, with the exception of the Central Valley project, where there were some big federal subsidies a long time ago. Now it's very hard to get actual subsidies for any new projects from the feds. It's much more likely to be kind of a loan or maybe some matching grants. The state water project was also funded by water users. In the case of Kern County, I think that the local taxpayers put in a little bit of extra money to help with that share to kind of lower the cost for agriculture. But by and large, we're talking about water user fees and to some extent supplemented with local taxes, land assessments, those kinds of things. So just to give you a sense of where the state comes in, the state actually collects user fees for some of its spending. For example, in that graph I just showed you back there, that state spending included state spending on the state water project, which it collects from water users. Where the state kind of comes in with its extra money to help fill gaps is through state bonds that voters approve. And we've been using bonds much more since the early 2000s for the water sector than in the past. This is showing you in, kind of constant dollars, in inflation adjusted dollars, the water bonds that California voters have passed and the ones that have failed since the 1970s. There was a big bond on the ballot in November 2018 that failed. That would have had a lot of money for the Valley, including for the Bryant-Kern Canal and some other conveyance infrastructure. It was rejected by California voters, including by voters in the Valley. If you just took the 8 Valley counties, the bond would not have passed. So, bonds are not always easy to pass. There was going to have been a bond on the administration wanted a bond on the ballot in this November, back before the pandemic and the recession, and that is not going to happen yet for a while. So I think, and this maybe is going to tee over well to Tommy, creative approaches are going to be needed to redirect and pool funding in order to tackle the SGMA-related challenges in the Valley. There are a lot of existing and potential sources. The new groundwater sustainability agencies have fee authority. It's, there's still a political challenge to get that approved by the local, water users, but that is a fee authority that should be used. We already have water, land, energy, and chemical use fees, and we can consider more of those in order to fund important things. Other local and regional taxes, I mentioned, in the case of Kern County, the example of a surcharge to help fund the state water project. There are other possibilities there. State and federal grants and credits can sometimes come in and be a real boost. And I don't want to minimize their role, but I just don't want people to think that that's manna from heaven either, because there are limits on what we're going to be able to see from that. I think attention to incentives are going to be really key for farmers. It's not just about the money, it's also going to be the water sometimes, and For example, having the flexibility to keep water rights from lands that they idle, to be able to stack that water and use it elsewhere. Local governments, we've talked with a lot of them, and they are quite worried about addressing the fiscal gaps from some of the land use changes. That includes not only if land's going to be fallow, but also even things like solar, which is a really good moneymaker for the landowner, can be challenging for local governments because of tax exemption on solar. So I'll wrap up with, just some thoughts that there's a lot of work to do. Much is at stake for this region's economy, public health, and the environment in meeting the challenges of SGMA. SGMA is going to be important for the long-term health of the valley's water resources. I guess we have a sort of optimistic approach to it. We think increasing flexibility, providing incentives, leveraging multiple benefits, and kind of a combination of smart supply and smart demand management strategies are going to get us there. Increased cooperation and coordination are going to be key, and that includes for funding. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Ellen, thank you for that great overview on all of the water needs. And thank you for addressing the annual versus perennial crop water needs. I know that was a big conversation in Slack yesterday. I would like to encourage you to go over to Slack and see if you can answer a few quick questions, but I have two really quick and we're running short on time. So we'll try to address both of them. The first one was, what is augmented water? I know the slide showed the recharge and reclaim water surface, but can you really just quickly?
Sure. So we use that term just to kind of distinguish between with the other category, which was shifting surface water around. Augmenting water in this case is finding ways to capture or repurpose water in ways that will actually add to the total amount of surface water available in the valley.
Okay.
So for example, during big flood events or big storms, there's some water that nobody's capturing right now. And some of that is not going to be possible to capture, but some of it is. And that's the water that would actually add to the total.
Perfect. Thank you. The other question was about the water plan. So we mentioned, I think it was related to a publication and an event you did a few weeks ago. And then you reiterated today that some of the water plans don't address everything that they need to. Can you elaborate just a quick bit on that?
Sure. So if you think about SGMA, I mean, we're not looking to achieve groundwater balance for its own sake. It's to avoid undesirable results. And those results, the valley has seen those with land subsidence, with dry wells. There's a potential, we've seen it in some places where pumping can actually cause water quality problems. In some parts of the state, seawater intrusion is an issue. In some parts of the state, there can be effects on surface water supplies and ecosystems. So the plans all have to be looking at those issues and saying how they're going to address them. We looked at just land subsidence and groundwater levels as relates to dry wells, and we found that there were some significant gaps in those two areas in the valley.
Thank you. Thank you. And once again, I'd like to encourage you to swing over to our Slack channel and interact with our guests. And I'd like to encourage every one of our guests to also go onto the Slack and have conversations with her. And just if the conversations, just direct them to the Slack channel for that presentation. Next, we're going to take a break. We have we're running a few minutes behind schedule, but we'll be back here at 10:45 a.m. Thank you. We'll see you soon. Security is set up in there, but we can't both be in the same room. Welcome back, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the jazz music from our Fresno State's jazz band. From Ellen, we heard how we have traditionally funded water infrastructure, and according to Scott's presentation yesterday, we will need $7 to $9 billion. It sounds to me like we're going to need traditional as well as new ways of funding that infrastructure. To provide an overview of what the new ways could be, we have Thomas Esqueda, former Associate Vice President for Water and Sustainability at Fresno State. Tommy, we're going to give you control of the screen. Click once to accept the control, and then from here, you'll be able to control your screen.
Okay, I clicked. Oh, there it is. Got it. Good morning. Are we ready to go?
We are. Okay,
great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for participating in the Infrastructure Summit. I think Ellen's presentation kind of highlighted kind of the four big things we've got to kind of come up with in looking at evaluating how to reimagine the water use in the San Joaquin Valley. the first part is that supply side, what's available to us. The first part is what's the supply side, what's available to us, what's our demand question, and how much water do we need to accommodate our demands. Once we have that and understand that demand, then how do we adjust the infrastructure to accommodate that? And then the big question is, how do you pay for it? And so that's the discussion we're going to have today in this portion of the program, is how to pay for it, with the idea being that demand, supply, and infrastructure are all other additional discussions that have to be ongoing, and they currently are ongoing. This presentation I'll give you is something you might see given to a board of supervisors, a city council, a metropolitan planning organization, some organization that's got to fund a large capital investment program and is looking for different ways to deliver it and then also to pay for it. And so that's this presentation we'll take you through here. This presentation I'm making to you today has been funded by a private philanthropic organization that had an interest in understanding, knowing that demand was an issue, supply was an issue, infrastructure was an issue, but that at some point that was all going to land on the desk of financing. How are you gonna pay for it? And so they had asked the university to take a look at different ways of funding a large infrastructure program. So to begin, learning how to use the mouse. There it is. Okay, so what we're looking at, based on Scott's presentation yesterday, and the work that Dr. Sunding did, we're starting with the idea of a one-time $7 billion water investment program. Again, Sunding talked about $7 billion as the perpetual annual losses due to water shortage conditions, and a worst case, forever. And then Scott's kind of preliminary look at the numbers was $7 to $9 billion. So we're looking at a $7 billion one-time water investment program. And what we're looking at, this is a sketch I've got, and then Scott, I know, has a different sketch. So all these sketches are currently in the process of being kind of melded together. But we're looking at a water investment program that has some allocation of funding for new surface water storage projects, new groundwater recharge banks, new ecosystem, environmental system projects, new drinking water projects or recycled water projects for wastewater, new watershed management, water quality, quantity improvement projects up in the watershed, and then new drinking water projects. So this is kind of the suite of projects that are currently being looked at. Again, nothing's been defined yet. That's the process Scott Hamilton is working through right now. And again, this program we're looking at is about $7 billion. We're looking at a funding plan that is over 40 years. And it's going to consist of these elements of it. So what we're looking at is a state grant of $1 billion. So again, of the $7 billion, we'd like to get $1 billion from the state, $1 billion from the feds. That's about 30% from them, which is below those 50% thresholds they always typically look for. So we're at about that. We're looking at greenhouse gas reduction funding, requesting that $331 million a year for 10 years. $331 million per year total over the first 10 years of the program. The idea being that if we do what we're supposed to do with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, is eliminate the undesirable results, get water levels up, we should reduce the amount of, one thing we'll do is we'll reduce the amount of water we're pulling out of the ground. So that'll be a greenhouse gas reduction. And we'll also reduce the amount of electricity it costs to pull that water out of the ground because we've stabilized the levels and increased the levels. We're looking at a water user surcharge of about $4 per acre foot to raise about $1.2 billion. And on the water user surcharge, this right now, the pro forma is built around $4 per acre foot, assuming that we can record and capture usage for about 10 million acre feet. There are a lot of different estimates of how much water is used on the valley floor. I think the total annual demand average, they say, is about 15 million acre feet per year. So we're saying we can capture data for about 10 million acre feet because there will be a reduction. And that data we'll capture through the, there's 108 GSAs now in the San Joaquin Valley. They have to report April 1st of every year how much water they, how much total water they use, groundwater, surface water, what they put in, what they put in. So there's data that will be generated that we can capture and apply this $4 per acre foot to. Again, we're thinking 10 million acre feet, $4 per acre foot. And then the big element of this program is a special sales tax of 0.5%, which would raise about $8.2 billion in cash over the 30 years that it would be in effect. It would be used for debt financing, so we could debt finance about $3.9 billion. So at a gross scale, those are the kinds of projects being looked at. These are the funding sources that would be used to fund that program. And again, right now, the Water Blueprint folks, Scott Hamilton and everybody are working to just understand, what might this infrastructure look like? How does it correlate with demand questions? How does it correlate with supply questions? The distribution of ag throughout the valley, just what does this infrastructure plan look like? He's engaged in discussions with DWR. They're talking with the Bureau of Reclamation. So a lot of discussions are happening around this infrastructure. And our focus right now is what might be the ways we could pay for that. And so one of the things we're looking at is, so of the $7 billion, it really generates about $5 billion in construction dollars. So, and the next slide will take you through, what the other $2 billion, we need the other $2 billion for. But these are generally the categories we're looking at for the $5 billion in actual infrastructure. We're looking at new conveyance canals. There's discussion about a new Cross Valley Canal that would connect the Kern Canal with the California Aqueduct. There's been discussions about a Trans Valley Canal, something that would go north-south up and down the valley. That would be between the Kern Canal and the California Aqueduct. As Ellen indicated, and probably Scott talked about, existing conveyance canal repair rehabilitation, got $800 million in there for that. So that's Delta Mendota, Kern, California Aqueduct. Once we build these new canals, we're going to get the water out of the canals through turnouts and delivered to different areas. So we got some allocation for that. We want to do new groundwater storage and banking facilities. So that's the purchase of the land and the creation of the banks. We got to get the water out. If we create a bank, we got to get the water out. So we got $180 million in there for pulling water out of these banks. New surface water storage facilities. And I say new surface water storage facilities, the emphasis right here is on projects. The first focus will be on projects that the California Water Commission's already approved: Del Puerto, Pacheco, Los Vaqueros, Sites Reservoir. There are places there are other programs that are looking for investors. And so here's a pot of money that we can make available to help maybe invest in some of those projects and get some water supply benefit. New drinking water facilities. We talked about that a lot. And then Ellen brought it up. We got to get the disadvantaged drinking water issues addressed. And so $1 million for that, for capital projects. New wastewater recycling facilities. This could be a combination of wastewater recycling facilities, desalination facilities, but things we can do to clean that water, those wastewaters that we generate, and make them available for second, third, fourth uses. And then we have new watershed management, habitat restoration, converting ag land to other means and purposes. Got about $250 million in for that. So $5 billion. Again, these numbers are all being evaluated through a stakeholder engagement process that the Blueprint guys are working on right now. And again, trying to get more people to engage in that discussion to understand we got the numbers in the right place. Are they the right size? Geographically, are we covering things? It just needs to be a broad discussion about this, and Scott's leading that effort. So the next idea that we've got to come up with is, how do you deliver $5 billion in capital project, a $5 billion capital program? Well, these are the things you're going to have to invest in as well. That will be part of that plan. You're going to have a program manager of some sort. We got $68 million for that. And that's really the air traffic controller. You're going to be really doing a lot of work throughout the 8 counties. And so getting those projects and all the elements required in sequence, the right time, get them funded, get the land purchased, get the mitigation, all that is an orchestration of immense detail. And so you're going to need some effort for that. You're going to do a lot of contracts. You're going to be buying land. You're going to be entering into consultant services agreement. It can be a lot of things. So you'll have a lot of financial, legal, administration costs. The water user coordination, we want to start there with the water users, get everybody on board and keep them there throughout the process. We have an allocation for that. Facility planning. This is really the kind of the high level, the next level of what the work that Scott's doing with the blueprint folks, just take it to that next level. Look at the supplies, the demands, facilities, and then we get into the what's the conventional stuff, preliminary engineering. You got to buy the land for the canals. You got to design it. You're going to go through the CEQA process, do some mitigation, and then you got to have somebody watch it get built. And so there's a whole construction piece of it. So altogether, you know, the $5 billion, you're going to spend $2 billion getting the $5 billion constructed. And so this is kind of that sequence of expenditures that we're looking at. And again, this is all very fluid, still in process, but you know, and Scott and his group are kind of working through this process to kind of get these details defined. So, you know, so how might those activities play out over the course? What we believe it can be done in a 10-year program, that you can get $7 billion spent in 10 years. Here is the way those dollars would get spent year 1 through year 10, how we would spend those dollars each of the years that we would be working to implement the program. So we have a 10-year plan, what will be done. And then we also have a 10-year plan where the money will come from. So you can see here we've got 10 years, how we'll draw down the funds to pay for this program. We've got the water, we've got the, so the funding sources are going to be the water user surcharge. We talked about the $4 per acre foot, greenhouse gas reduction funds. That's how we'll draw those dollars down. We'll get a state match grant. We're hoping $1 billion. That's how we burn through that. Federal match grant, $1 billion. That's how we would use that. And then we bring in the debt financing dollars as the final, really closing out the capital. We will build the capital facilities with debt finance money. The majority of the capital projects would be dealt with debt finance money. And again, you can see there's about 4.2 billion of the 4.2 billion of the 5 billion will be debt financed. So how might the debt financing play out? So here's kind of what we looked at. What we want to look at is the forecast. We're talking about a 0.5-cent sales tax. And so that's going to be applied to annual taxable sales transactions. And this is for the 8-county San Joaquin Valley. And so we're assuming that year 1 of the program, if this tax gets approved, year 1, there'll be $46.9 billion in transactions conducted. And I'll show you how that relates to current day taxable sales transactions, because we want to be conservative. And we're showing that growing to a value, taxable sales transaction growing to a value of $62 billion in year 30 of this program. You know, that forecast, the 0.5-cent sales tax will generate $234 million a year across the 8 counties. We'll then also apply the $40 million in annual water user free revenue. And then those funds will be used to pay the debt service payment. And then we'll have some residual money left over, because one of the things we really want, we will, and then so again, the forecasted tax revenues will be $312 million in year 30. In our annual debt service payment, it'll stay the same. It's going to be a fixed annual payment. And so one of the things we also want to talk about, and I think Tom Holyoke talked about, is that we're going to have some governance institution that manages this, that actually signs the contracts, buys the land, you know, does all of the contracting and legal work to make these program go. And so we've got an allocation of that entity of $10 million in year 1. And then that'll grow to $23 million in year 30. Again, we've got a lot of dollars out deployed in the system. So we're building a lot, we're commissioning a lot. So we're just closing out the program. So that's how that will grow. The other thing that this financing plan develops is a reserve fund account that we will have available to us as the program evolves. Each of the individual capital projects will have contingencies included, probably starting at about 30 to 40%, but on bid day, we'll get that down to 10. But things happen along the way in a project. We're going to be crossing roads, we're going to be buying land, we're going to be entering onto different private property parcels. I mean, just things happen when you're in construction. So we want to have a reserve balance available to us to account for those conditions that will require changes as we go along. And then that'll grow to, $25 million a year we'll be putting into that account. It'll accumulate up to about a $500 million balance for us to take care of those unforeseen, unplanned conditions. And if we don't use any of those dollars, we wouldn't use them for new projects, more projects, betterments. we would just retire the debt early and just cash out those dollars and make the final payments on the debt financing. So the financing plan is built this way. And let's talk a little bit about how that looks when we think about tax revenues. So again, we're going to apply this half-cent sales tax to taxable sales transactions in the Valley. So you can see how they've kind of grown over the years. In 97, it was 26.6 billion taxable sales transactions. Right before the fiscal crisis, it grew to $52 billion. And then the fiscal crisis hit, and we lost $10.2 billion over that time period. So it was a big hit to the system. Now we're in COVID. So the way right now in 2019, the taxable sales transaction totaled about 71 billion. So you can see we recovered pretty well and on a pretty aggressive scale. So our taxable sales forecast for the debt financing plan is this. We're assuming our financing plan, the one I just showed you, is that COVID is going to cost us 23.8 billion. And I don't want anybody to quote that, but we're just, for purposes of building a financing plan, we had to account for COVID impacting taxable sales transactions. So this is our estimate. We want it to be less than this. Trust me, we want this to be absolutely less than this. But for financing purposes, we want to assume it's going to be twice as bad as what we saw in the fiscal crisis. So we're starting our funding at 46.8 billion. And you can see we're growing it. The growth is about 1%, and that's the 62 billion we talked about earlier. So ideally, when you build a financing plan like this, you want it to be conservative. You want to create a situation where the economy is going to outperform the plan. And so that's what we've done here. We believe the economy will recover quicker. We believe it's a pretty big loss we're going to have to start with, but we believe that we can get this done. And again, if it turns out the economy does outperform like we thought, and the 46 isn't 46 and the 62 isn't 62, it's a higher number, all that really happens is we retire the debt early and we rescind the special tax early. So and we can have that all spelled out as part of the ballot measure for this across the 8 counties. It's used to fund, projects that are receiving funding from state and financing. Those are the kind of things we can define. If it gets paid off early, we'll go ahead and retire it early and rescind it early. Those are all the things that get defined in a ballot measure that we could work through if this was an idea. And again, this is just an idea. It's not the only idea. So one of the things that we looked at is, these are each of the 8 counties, San Joaquin to Kern, the average taxable sales transaction from 97 to 99. So this is really the midpoint. You saw that curve earlier. It's kind of a pretty heavy spike up and to the right. This is the average. So San Joaquin, 8.8 billion, down to Kern, 11.2 billion. It's kind of how it distributes throughout the Valley. The revenue potential of a half-cent sales tax in each of the counties, we're showing that 44 million in San Joaquin, that up to 55 million down in Kern. And then here would be the potential debt issuance capacity if you use those revenues to finance debt for water projects in your area only, that only San Joaquin want to do something just for themselves. So they could generate a capital fund of about 730, a debt finance, a capital fund of about 730 million. You can see Kern about 910 million. But really what this is intended to show is the buying power of the San Joaquin Valley if we pool our resources together to build the infrastructure that's needed. It's not unlike when you look at the commodity side of the house. The state of California puts out 59 billion. 35 of those billion are in this 8-county region. The state of Iowa, total output of state of Iowa is 27 billion. So these 8 counties are quite a powerhouse in terms of ag production. And as you can see, generating some revenue that could be used to pool together and build infrastructure. So that's kind of the idea that we had with the in putting this together, the financing plan. As I mentioned earlier, this is part of a larger report that has been funded by a private philanthropic agency that covers all of the different topics. But this is the one element of that report that we're making available to folks today. So I think the final thing I will talk about is the estimated sales tax impact on low-income residents, because that's going to be an issue. We're going to have to deal with it. It's not like it doesn't have an impact. It will have an impact. There's a lot of ways to look at how that impact might be. And so Here's one way we kind of looked at it. San Joaquin Valley, the total population is about 4.3 million. The average median household income across those 8 counties is 53,000. The average per capita income, sorry, not per capita income is 22,000. The median gross rent is 12,000. And then the Census Bureau poverty threshold, family of 4, is about $25,000. So assuming a family of 4 in their entire earnings, every dollar they receive, 25,701, is subject to the special sales tax. That you're not taking accounting, you're not taking any deductions for, income taxes, you're not taking any deductions for housing, you're just, all the 25,701 is subject to the sales tax. That would have a financial impact of about $11 per month on an individual family of 4 earning 25. Now it's going to be less certainly for people making less and more for people making more. And we're not making any judgment on whether that's a lot of money or not a lot of money. For some folks, we know it's a lot of money. But this is the kind of impact that we would need to be thinking about it and being able to address if the decision was to kind of think about this as a funding model for infrastructure in the valley. So with that, I think we're good, Laura.
Thank you, Tommy. That's some innovative ideas on how to fund our infrastructure. So in an interest of time, I'm going to ask you 2 questions, and if you just keep the answers short, and then tomorrow we'll go more in depth into some of them. So the first one is if the blueprint plan for the projects includes only new stuff or existing conversations such as the Delta tunnels.
No, this project doesn't have any money for anything in the Delta right now. And again, that's just simply a factor of Scott's kind of working with everybody on, I think we've got the categories down of where the categories might spend money in for infrastructure, the $5 billion. It's now, what are the details of where that goes? How much might be stuff in the Delta, stuff in Kern, stuff out on the west side, stuff out the east side. I think those are all things we're still trying to find, but there is an expectation that this money will go to fix issues with the Bryan-Kern Canal, the Delta-Mendota Canal, and the California Aqueduct. We've got to restore those capacities.
Thank you. The other comment was the amount allocated or estimated for the existing canals repairs and rehabs. Somebody mentioned that they seems kind of low, especially if you're discussing the Central Valley project, the State Water project, and the Delta-Mendota Canal.
Yeah, so there are probably estimates for the Delta-Mendota Canal and the California Aqueduct. So we have 800 million, I believe, in there for that number. I think I've seen numbers for the Bryan-Kern Canal anywhere from 200 to 450. So we were kind of thinking right now lacking, and again, this is the part that Scott's working on, is getting the details of how much is the Delta-Mendota Canal fixed, how much is the California Aqueduct fixed, and then we can look at that 800 and adjust it up or down and then correlate that with what we need to invest in for the Bryan-Kern Canal.
Thank you. It seems like there's still preliminary numbers as you're still developing the list of projects or potentials and where all of this would fit, especially because it's a 40-year plan. We can't have all the details at the moment. There was another comment about the regressive tax effect, especially on poverty. And Tommy mentioned a little bit about it, but also the California Water Institute will have a publication coming out early next week, and that is addressed in that publication. So everyone keep an eye out for that publication that we will make sure that everybody gets a link to. And Tommy, I'd like to encourage you to head over to the Slack space and interact with our guests and answer any additional questions that people might have. And I'd like to encourage everyone to continue the conversation over at the channel specific to Tommy's presentation. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be back here at 11:15 and enjoy the Fresno State Jazz Band for a few minutes. Welcome back, and I hope everybody was enjoying that Fresno State Jazz Band. So from Tommy, we heard that a few innovative ways how water infrastructure can be funded. And CWI was curious on what the public was thinking about some of these innovative ideas, but it sounds to me like we'll have to do, I'm sorry. So CWI was curious about what the public thought about some of these things and partnered with the Institute for Leadership and Public Policy to do a public survey on the topic. Next, we'll hear from Lisa Bryant on the preliminary results of that survey. Just as a reminder, please submit any questions in the Slack channel. And I want to remind everyone that we're at a 1 minute lag time on the public live stream. So it's important that you submit your questions as we go, as they come to mind and not at the end of the presentation. Lisa is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at California State University, Fresno. Her preliminary research interests are in the areas of political behavior, campaign and elections, election administration, political communication, public opinion, as well as survey and experimental methodology. Prior to coming to Fresno State, she worked as a survey director for the Research and Polling Institute. Lisa, we will share your presentation right now, and we will give you control of the presentation. We will give you control of the mouse. The first click is you accepting that, and then the second click will have you controlling the screen. Lisa, the stage is yours.
Got it. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. And like Laura said, these are the preliminary results. So we got the survey data back Friday at 5 o'clock, but it's still in the field. So about 80% of our goal has been met in terms of collecting responses. So this is very much still an active survey, and we will put the final complete report up on both the California Water Institute's website and the Institute for Leadership and Public Policy's website. I'd like to say that this is a survey that was written in collaboration, not only with Tommy and Laura, but also my colleague, Dr. Jeff Cummins, who's now the Dean of College of Social Sciences. So he's with us in spirit today. So the purpose of our survey was we wanted to get an idea. We've heard from all of these experts, and many of you watching this stream probably have a lot of background knowledge about water supply in the San Joaquin Valley, but a lot of this requires funding and support from the public. So we really wanted to know, well, how do voters think about water supply in the San Joaquin Valley, and are they willing to support it? Do they see this as a critical issue? So, you know, we can't just go into asking for voter support for money with the assumption that they all view the issue the same way that the experts do. So one of the purposes of the survey was to get an idea of how people view water supply in the San Joaquin Valley. Does everybody view it as a critical issue? We wanted to gauge support for infrastructure programs that are needed to address the issue, and we wanted to gauge willingness to pay to improve those through possibly new taxes, like a special tax like Tommy mentioned. So we're going to ask specifically about that. So those are the big questions, right? But there's more interesting sort of nuanced questions that we needed to get to too, to have a better understanding of how people actually view these issues. So do they view this as one of the most important issues facing the Valley? Do people think that our current water levels are sufficient to sustain both residential communities and ag communities, or do people view those differently? There's the idea of forming a regional organization. So Tommy mentioned, and I think that my colleague Tom Holyoke is going to talk about the need for a government agency to manage these funds and to distribute funds and to lead the projects. And so would people support the creation of a regional organization, a new government agency to solve these infrastructure problems? Would people pay for the special tax? And do people think that, who do people think should pay for it? Should it be on all residents equally through a special tax, or should it just be those who are related to the ag industry? And then their willingness, of course. So in order to answer these questions, we fielded what we call the San Joaquin Valley Water Infrastructure Financing Survey. It's easy to say 10 times fast. And the survey it includes all 8 counties in the San Joaquin Valley. It was limited to registered voters only. So we know that when we're talking about asking voters to pay for something, we want to make sure that we actually limit our surveys to voters, not just the general population, because we might get very different responses. Our survey is about 20 questions in length, and we targeted only likely voters, which we defined in our survey as people who had voted in at least 2 of the last 4 statewide elections. The survey was collected with live phone interviews, and because most people have cell phones today, our sample ended up being 70% cell phones and 30% landlines, which exceeds the recommendations from most polling best practices today. And it was in the field in July 2020, so during COVID, which of course we have to take into account, and actually we do see the impacts in some of the responses in the surveys. And it's still in the field. We wanted it to be done by August 1st, but because there are a limited number of pollies working in call centers, they haven't been able to get it completed quite as quickly as we'd like. So we did weight the data based on the voter registration file demographics of the 8 counties in the San Joaquin Valley to be proportional to the distribution of population across the counties, but also partisan registration, gender, race, ethnicity, and other information that's available about the voter registration file. So we ended up with a final sample for our analysis of 355, which gives us a 5% margin of error at this time. We hope that that goes down when we get our full sample. So like I said, these are preliminary results. We did have an opening statement at the beginning of the survey, which I think is important to point out, that we said we're conducting a survey about water issues. So people were primed to be thinking about water. So our first question in the survey was, what are some of the most important issues facing the San Joaquin Valley? And we asked, aside from coronavirus, because as pointed out, this was in the field while people were home because of coronavirus, and in fact laid off because of coronavirus. And so we actually did see an increased number of people reporting that they were currently unemployed. And I try to account for some of that in the analysis as well. So aside from coronavirus, what do you think is the most important issue facing the San Joaquin Valley today? Oh, weird. Okay. And so you can see that water supply was actually, now granted, I said they were primed, but water supply was the #1 issue facing the San Joaquin Valley, is what most people said. So about 28% of the sample said that. And you can see that jobs and economy were about 22%, 21.7%. And then homelessness, housing, and poverty was the 3rd most popular answer, with about 1 in 10 people giving that response, unprompted. So these were, they didn't get a list of responses to choose from. These were what they volunteered to the person over the phone. So all of these tie very closely with the talks that we heard from Dr. Qualle yesterday, from the talks that we've been hearing about how this is going to impact low income communities, right? And so you can see here, anytime that I present results and I break them out with any demographics, these were the demographics where we saw sizable differences in the responses. So under the heading ag, those are people who reported, of people who are currently employed, currently have a job, people who reported that their jobs are related to the ag industry, and then versus people who have jobs not related to the ag industry. And so you can see among those in the ag industry, compared to non-ag jobs, there was a significantly higher response for water supply being the most pressing issue for the San Joaquin Valley today. We also asked about the economy and how people view the economy. And so this is an interesting result. So you can see that the vast majority of people in the San Joaquin Valley reported right now that they think the economy is not doing so good or is doing poorly. But you can see that there's a sizable difference by gender, which, thinking about unemployment, thinking about poverty rates, we know women and women with children are more likely to live in poverty. We can see that men are much more likely to report that the economy is doing good than women are. So, and so we do see some actual gender differences in other responses throughout the survey, but which could be related to how they view the economy. So we also looked at, so for people whose jobs depend on ag, or thinking about the overall economy of the ag, of ag and water in the valley, we said the San Joaquin Valley's economy depends on agricultural production more so than any other place in the state. I thought the responses here were actually kind of interesting. So overall, people in the San Joaquin Valley strongly agree that we depend on ag more than other parts of the state, although those, and this could end up not being a significantly difference, but those in non-ag related jobs were more likely to strongly agree with that. You can see overall about 90% of people think that we strongly rely on ag. So I think that these are important because the idea is the public is aware, they're well aware that we rely on ag in San Joaquin Valley, and it's really important to the health of our overall economy. We then asked, do you think that our future water supply is adequate enough for residential use? And you can see here, people are pretty split down the middle. So about 40% say yes, 45% say no, but there's 15% who just are undecided. They don't know and don't have strong thoughts about it. You can see there are some sizable differences, again, between people in ag and non-ag. So people who have ag-related jobs are more likely to say, yes, they think for residential use, our water supply is fine, as opposed to those in non-ag. And the men, of course, are also more likely to say that, as you can see. But when we move to agricultural use, so this question is about agricultural use, you can see the numbers are much, leaning much heavier towards no. People don't think that there's an adequate supply. So this is important because people can differentiate the use, and you can see that they're much more solidified in their answer about what we have currently is not necessarily sustainable for the future of our ag, which is important to our economy. We asked about whose responsibility it is to maintain future water supplies and to address these shortages for the future. And we asked, who do you think should lead these efforts? So 31% thinks the state government should lead the efforts. Smaller numbers, 7.5% and 6.4% think it should be, federal government and local government. Only 3% said the private sector should lead these efforts. But the majority of people, 51%, said a combination of public and private efforts should be used to address shortages in the future. And that didn't differentiate very much, 5-6%, between people with jobs related to ag and people outside of the ag industry. So we asked about support for the creation of a regional organization, like Tommy talked about. And our question, I'm giving you the body of who we included in this description to people taking the survey. So we said there's a proposal to create a regional organization in the San Joaquin Valley with representatives from local governments, low-income communities, agriculture, and environmental interests to develop. So you can see that really all of the key stakeholders are involved when we asked people about creating this organization. And there was overwhelming support in terms of creating a regional organization that would come up with proposals and manage solutions for future water supply. So really, we see some slight difference between Democrats and Republicans here, or actually it's Republicans versus members of no party preference or Democrats, but still across the board, just overwhelming support for the creation of such an organization. We then moved on to asking people what they thought about possible solutions. And so this is where we might expect to see some differences between how the general population thinks we should address shortages versus what experts think we should do, right? So we said, should we build more dams? And these are in order of popularity of the response given by people in the survey. So 33% think that we should create more storage, build more dams, 23% install more efficient technology, 16% say that we should repair current water infrastructure, 12% say groundwater recharge, which we heard was the most economical solution, right? But only 12% of people think that's the way we should go. About 11% say we should build more canals or aqueducts to move the water. Of course, that doesn't create more water, that just helps us move water. And then only 4% say that we should actually fallow lands. So we do see that there's some divisions here between people in ag and non-ag. The biggest division is in this repairing current water infrastructure, whereas voters think that that's a more feasible solution than people in the ag industry do, but that's what the responses look like. So people here, it looks like, are in favor of building dams. And that could be because of messaging that we've seen in the Valley for the past several years in terms of being in favor of dams. We do see, again, this slide is almost identical. However, it looks at partisan differences. And so you can see here, interestingly, install water efficient technology was more favored by Republican voters than by, or at least registered voters, than other groups. And that's the biggest difference that we see by partisanship in the responses. So then we moved on to asking people, well, who do you think should pay for this? So state government was the most popular response, followed by the federal government, then city and county. And then we also asked, should it be farmers only, or should it be all residents in the San Joaquin Valley? And so when we look at this, we can see that state government is the most popular, but we wanted to look further into these people who said, should it be farmers only, or should it be all residents? So if people responded farmers only, we said, well, how would farmers actually pay for that if it was farmers only? So we said, well, would it be through an added property tax assessment? Would it be a consumption charge, which you can see 76% of people thought it should be a consumption charge. So charge farmers based on how much water they're using. And then for people who said all residents should pick up the tab, we asked a property tax assessment, a water consumption surcharge, a sales tax, a special sales tax. And again, I left out no in here because it's pretty high, 10% is pretty high, but 53% here also thought a water consumption tax should be distributed to all people. And so again, just as a reminder, these responses for farmers only are pretty low. So we have to take even that with a grain of salt. But for all residents, 1 in 5 people said all residents should pay. And of those people, 53% thought a consumption tax was a feasible solution. Following up on the special sales tax, we said, well, one way we could pay through this is through a special sales tax of 0.5%, and we asked them to read 0.5% specifically. If this appeared on the ballot, how likely would you be to support a special sales tax? And so if we look at very likely and somewhat likely, we can see about 68% said that they would be likely to support this. Now, I will point out that when we asked this question, we did include the language that this would be equivalent to $1 on every $200 of goods that you purchased. So we gave, because 0.5 is sort of an abstract concept for most people, we wanted to give some sort of tangible example that they could think about, well, $1 out of every $200 is not necessarily that much. And so you can see about 68% of people said they would be very likely to support it. And I thought, remember, we asked that question about, well, how do you think the economy is doing? Do you think it's doing good or poor? So I truncated these into just people who thought it was doing very good or somewhat good versus poor or very bad. And you can see that here we still don't see that many differences. So I don't necessarily know that people's perceptions of the current economy influence. I mean, what this suggests is that it wouldn't influence their willingness to pay for 0.5%, which I think is really important to point out because when talking with Tommy about the plan, we were really worried that people's view of the economy in COVID might influence their willingness to actually support a special sales tax, but it doesn't appear in this way anyway that that's the case. We did ask people what would be your concerns over a special sales tax, and maybe not surprisingly, and this could be related to stuff we hear in the media about high-speed rail and various things like that. The primary concern that we heard from people, almost 63%, said that the money would be diverted to purposes other than water projects. And so I think that when asking people about a special sales tax or creating a regional organization, one of the things that we're going to have to focus on is how do you assure voters that this money is truly going to go to water projects, that there's going to be oversight about that, because that's a big concern for voters. And then we asked, which of the following are you most concerned about when considering alternatives to address water shortages? Are you most concerned about maintaining your current job and income, sustaining regional economy for the benefit of everyone, or keeping taxes low? And again, you can see overwhelmingly, right, that people are concerned about sustaining the regional economy for the benefit of everyone. And this isn't exclusive to people who work in the ag industry. In fact, 60% of people who don't work in the ag industry said that we need to be concerned about sustaining the regional economy for everyone. So I think that there is a good demonstration here of support for doing something about water shortages in the future. Some of the takeaways, I think, from this are that there is this broad consensus that water supply and ag plays a key role in the success of the San Joaquin Valley. There's strong support for a regional organization that includes all of the key stakeholders. And I think the fact that low-income communities that are most often affected by big major projects was included, that environmental concerns would be included. I think that probably that language being included in the setup of the question was probably influential in asking people about their support for this. We find that there is support for a special sales tax, but I would say, and I could be biased as someone who studies messaging and negative persuasion, right? That messaging is key. So I think that using that example of how this is actually going to affect people's pocketbooks should they pass a tax is really important, much more so than just focusing on the 0.5%. And then finally, looking at people who were, maybe affected by job loss or who thought that the economy was not in a good position, they're still willing to support this increase. But we should be aware, people who work on this project as it moves forward, there could be some partisan opposition. So in framing the issue of support, I think that's something that's probably going to have to be addressed. So, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We have a couple of questions. So the first one is, what do you consider an ag job? So you showed us the ag versus non-ag, like who determined that? How did we?
Okay, so that's a great question. So we actually listed for people what we considered ag jobs. So the things that we included were agricultural equipment, agricultural chemicals, farming, crop production or field worker, food processing or food production, food distribution, and then financing, banking, law, or engineering that are related specifically to ag. And then we had the category other. So if somebody considered their job related to ag, they volunteered. First of all, they were asked, is your job related to ag or not? And then we asked, well, what type of job related to ag do you have? So people could volunteer a job. And so it's actually really interesting to code those responses, because there were several people who said, I do ag education. I'm a teacher, but I teach ag education. Or I'm a caterer. So one person said, I'm a caterer, but I often cater events for people in the ag industry. So my job is dependent on having those customers. So it wasn't highly restrictive in what people could consider their job related to ag, but we did have the 7 key categories that we consider to be traditional ag jobs.
Thank you. There was a slide where you told us the 3 top concerns that people have right now. I think it was water supply, homeless, and I think jobs.
And jobs in the economy.
Do you remember what some of the other ones were?
Yes. So another big one was the environment and air quality. A lack of access to healthcare in the Valley was another big one. I have them right here, actually. No, sorry. I remember that several people said, actually a very popular one, which I thought was funny, which a fair number of people volunteered, was about people just not being kind and civil to each other, that we have a lot of political tension, I believe, in the Valley is what they were getting at. But yeah, the other big ones were healthcare and also air quality and environmental concerns.
Very good, thank you. There is another question about the change in the special sales rate tax, but I think that is a perfect question for our panel tomorrow. So thank you very much, Lisa. I want to encourage you to head over to our Slack workspace and answer any more questions or any comments and just interact with our guests. And in an interest in time, we're going to skip the next break and go directly into the next presentation, but also I want to remind you that we would love for you to continue this conversation even after the event is over at each of the presentations channels. So from Tommy, we heard that a few innovative ways to fund water infrastructure. From Lisa, we heard what the public currently thinks about some of those things. And we also heard from both Lisa and Tommy that we're going to need an organization or some kind of overseeing board to keep track of some of those projects and funding strategies. And to give us some recommendations on what those can be and how they can be formed, we have Tom Holyoke. Tom Holyoke is professor of political science at Fresno State, where he has taught for 16 years. Among other things, he teaches courses about politics of water in California and the American West. Tom, we're going to share your presentation, and then we're going to give you control of the screen. Your first click gives you accept the control, and then the second one is you taking control over the screen. Tom, the stage is yours.
Okay, I think I have it here. Thank you very much. I think I've got my lighting figured out here in my office. Good, thanks, Laura. Well, I will touch a bit on some organizational forms for infrastructure governing institutions in a moment. I think I want to start off talking a bit about what I think should be some basic principles for any kind of public agency dealing with a problem such as water. public agencies overseeing financing and managing water infrastructure are, in fact, public, which means they are governed by a political process requiring a significant degree of input from stakeholders and constituencies, and that also requires accountability. With that in mind, I think there are some basic principles here we should consider. The first is that however the governing board of an agency is structured, it should be that benefits and costs are distributed in a manner that helps the greatest number of people within the agency's geographic jurisdiction, really the greatest good for the greatest number. This not only means that the benefits of any public project, such as building infrastructure and providing water, should be shared widely over the proposed jurisdiction, but those with the greatest need for water should have a priority in having their needs fulfilled, whether that is people in poor communities. And it's nice to see that, Lisa, Tommy, and Amber Crowell the other day really kind of focused a lot on that. Whether this is people with poor communities with shallow wells, or farmers who have lost access to their water, or even dying wetlands. Allocation within the jurisdiction is the hardest political decision that the leaders of any public entity are going to have to make. Getting it right, though, helps to make the agency and its actions legitimate in the eyes of the public, who to a large extent are going to have to be footing the bill on this. And it was good to see from Dr. Bryant's results that there does seem to be a fair amount of widespread support for it. Indeed, the cost of burden sharing, the cost burden should really kind of reflect a similar principle, I think, to the first one. While a project's cost should be spread out over the region within the project's jurisdiction, there is also a need to not impose too great a share of the cost on those who cannot easily repay it. Unfortunately, this principle, it seems to me, can easily clash with the first principle of providing the greatest benefit to the most people, because often those who really need guaranteed access to more fresh water may also be some of those with the least ability to pay. Unfortunately, it seems to me that there might be a temptation in organizational design to sidestep this problem by simply not including everyone who needs water from the project within its jurisdiction. That is, not to bring in as stakeholders everybody who really needs access to water simply because there's concerns about their ability to repay part of the cost. Since cost usually ends up reaching into everyone's pocket in some manner, excluding any constituency within the region creates a pretty serious problem of political legitimacy. Instead, poor beneficiaries should be included, and perhaps costs arranged in such a way that their cost burden starts low, but perhaps grows over time. Hopefully, as their ability to pay also grows, as they start to enjoy some of the benefits of the water supplied through the infrastructure project. This means that care must be taken in terms of deciding who the members of any water infrastructure entity might be, and the power their representatives will wield on its governing boards. Some types of member governments might perhaps have more members on the board if they represent more people, or their votes might have greater weight than representatives from member governments with smaller populations. In a sense, we see this with the political construction of water districts, where the voting power of members is weighted by property. But of course, there is, again, a political tension between voting schemes based on those who need water the most and those who have the greatest ability to pay for it. That being the case, some infrastructure agencies might, again, opt to sidestep this thorny issue by giving an equal vote to everyone's representative on the board. Equal voting does have its advantages. It's certainly simple, but it does not necessarily produce truly equitable outcomes in terms of who gets the most water, in terms of, and also in terms of the greatest need for water. Whatever voting method is used and whomever gets most of the water or the biggest bill for funding the water infrastructure, the final overriding principle should be that the entity created to fund and manage new water infrastructure should take as holistic approach to it really as possible. Overall, I guess that would mean using water for as many functions as there are stakeholders in the proposed regional jurisdiction. And that includes the environment as much as it does agriculture and domestic use. This can really ultimately mean that there are as many stakeholders, which also means it can be very hard to find answers and come to consensus on many of the complex and competing demands leaders will confront. I mean, more stakeholders, more constituencies is probably going to mean more people actually involved on the governing board, and that can make governing boards, well, difficult to govern. Since it may not be possible or practical to have every stakeholder group therefore represented on the governing board, a series of advisory boards and even community liaisons should be built into the system to have as broad an outreach to everyone in the jurisdiction as possible. Again, it is this kind of holistic approach that will likely have the greatest political legitimacy amongst all stakeholders, and thus likely receive the most short-term and probably long-term support. Let's see here. I won't spend much time here on joint powers authorities, which is probably one of the most likely candidates for any kind of water infrastructure governance. Many of you attending probably worked for a JPA or worked with JPAs and probably know more about them than I do. But they are a good way to create regional solutions to problems. And as Tommy's been very much talking about, we are very much looking at a broad regional solution to our regional water problems. I guess what I would like to point out, this is something that's attracted me a lot, and I've written about this in some of the reports I've done for the California Water Institute. I'd like to point out is there is a variation on the traditional joint powers authority structure that might be especially beneficial and may even help address some of the issues I've already raised, perhaps. I believe that enhanced infrastructure finance districts, or EIFDs, have been around for some time. They gained some prominence after Governor Brown eliminated urban redevelopment agencies and gave some of their powers over to EIFDs. While I believe they have to be formed within JPA structures, not any JPA membership structure can actually form an EIFD. Since the plan to create an EIFD, meaning its public finance authority and its financing plan, must be initiated by a city or county, as opposed to, say, an irrigation district. This means political jurisdictions representing larger, more varied numbers of people will need to be included in any governing entity that incorporates an EIFD. And since EIFDs are within JPAs, it again means it's an opportunity to deal with regional water problems with a combination of local governments from all around the region. Another reason to want to include many types of governing entities, including counties and cities, is that the EIFD can make use of their powers of taxation, general and special, as well as assessments of fees, whether they are user fees, development fees, property taxes, or even parcel taxes. An EIFD may be especially attractive because it can issue bonds with terms of up to about 45 years, which means the cost of infrastructure financing can be really spread out, each year's payment less than it might be otherwise under a different kind of system with a shorter horizon. And this makes it easier for all of the stakeholders, including those stakeholders with less means, to be able to contribute to repayment. It may also be true that as the 45 years go by, the benefits of additional water may yield, we hope they'll yield, economic improvements for even the poorest residents in the region, so that later in time, they may find it easier to help pay off the bonds than they would earlier in time. It is also worth noting that it is easier for EIFDs to issue bonds, requiring only a 55% of the vote of everyone in the identified jurisdiction, not the usual 2/3. And of course, as successors to redevelopment agencies, EIFDs may receive the tax increment financing that redevelopment agencies used to get. In other words, they get to capture some of the increase in tax revenue attributable to water infrastructure that the EIFD helped to finance in the first place. One thing to be careful of is that while EIFDs do not need an explicit public vote to be created, this is not necessarily the benefit that some might expect. If everyone in a jurisdiction had to vote to form an EIFD, as they must do to create, say, an irrigation district, then everyone becomes a stakeholder and may be more supportive of bonds and taxes. Without this kind of political legitimacy, some may resent the creation of the EIFD and the JPA that encompasses it. In fact, I believe Dr. Bryant was just talking about potential resistance to any kind of taxes that may need to be imposed. There might be greater resistance. Yeah, it might be harder to even get the 55% approval to issue bonds. I'm going to bypass this slide just for a moment. I will come back to it. Just want to hit the last slide here for a moment. This is from, I think it's the second report that I wrote for the California Water Institute. It simply details the kind of structure, a JPA that contains an EIFD. It also shows the different kinds of advisory boards that may be put in. So on the top row up here, we have the different kinds of government entities that might create a JPA and therefore an EIFD, member counties, cities, special districts like water and irrigation districts, and they form the board of directors. Then under that, either a city or a county would have to initiate the process for forming an EIFD. And then once that's approved, then hopefully money would start to flow. And then there would also be a series of advisory committees, which different members of the public and experts can all be included on to give feedback on the best way to use a lot of this financing for all sorts of different purposes, ranging from drinking water systems, water recycling, ground banking, and even to habitat restoration. And it keeps providing a continuous feedback to the members of the board of directors of the JPA, who can revise how best to use the funds, how it's all going, and whether the financing plan needs to be changed. So now moving back, well, let's keep these out here, I guess. A few final considerations. First, in order to have as much political legitimacy as possible with voters in the proposed jurisdiction, the governing board of the JPA and EIFD should be really as large as possible, but no larger than necessary to provide equitable representation. It's kind of a Goldilocks principle, I suppose. A board that is too large is too unwieldy. It's hard to get a good majority of votes. In fact, sometimes it's even hard to get quorum to conduct a business. On the other hand, a board that is too small creates concerns about poor representation and whether some constituencies are not being represented at all. Second, developing a holistic plan regarding water storage, conveyance, recharge, and identifying beneficiaries should probably define regions by water basins or even entire watersheds. That is, the jurisdiction that would be under the JPA should probably encompass an entire water basin, so that the entire hydrological system there can be managed as one entity, because of course it really is just one entity: groundwater, surface water, and all the beneficiaries. Third, Remember that any kind of voting scheme on the governing board that appears to give one set of stakeholders more power than others might feel they ought to have will make it much harder for the JPA or the EIFD to build the political support it needs to accomplish anything. Fourth, in the slide I just showed, it would be extremely useful to have advisory committees with community members, policy experts, hydrologists, and even community liaisons whose job it is to reach out specifically to various stakeholders, especially some of the poorer stakeholders who might not be able to get the same kind of information that other stakeholders can, and to report back. Fifth, whatever revenue streams are used to finance the infrastructure, the cost of water should be set as accurately, realistically as possible. Too much public sector subsidization means that water is more likely to be used in a careless manner. Essentially, the more people are going to have to really pay realistic prices for water, we hope, the more carefully they'll use it. And finally, the JPA and the EIFD should have a long-range management and financing plan, say about 50 years. In fact, I think Tommy even alluded to this. So this allows the needs of tomorrow to be well thought out today. But the fundamentals of the plan should be continuously revisited, say every 5 years. The governing board and the community liaisons and advisory board should all collectively review the plan, make sure it still satisfies the needs we need to solve, and make changes if it doesn't. So thank you all very, very much. Up to you, Laura.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate that thorough discussion on JPLs and how we govern this enterprise. I have one question so far, and actually two questions for you. The first one is, how do you see political parties playing a factor in the creation of these governing agencies?
Well, political parties themselves would not have explicit roles. I suppose in the sense that there is a great deal of partisan leanings out there right now. A lot of people leaning right, a lot of people leaning left. But we also need to be able to bring everybody together in order to make this work. When I talk about having different stakeholders involved in the board and the whole plan taking a holistic approach, that's going to not only bring in a lot of people probably of a conservative bent, but probably a lot of environmentalists and advocates for the poor who may be of a little left-leaning persuasion. And they're all going to have to learn to work together. That's going to take some doing and a great deal of willingness on everyone's part to make it work.
Hey, you're exactly right. We're all going to have to do this together, aren't we?
We have to find the better part of ourselves.
Yeah. The second question was, do you know of any classes at Fresno State that cover this sort of type of understanding of governance?
Well, it's a little self-serving, I suppose, but I would say that Political Science 175 does, which is my class on water politics and policy, which I'm teaching this semester.
Awesome. We'll fill that class for you.
It's already full.
Okay. All right. Well, too late, folks. I want to encourage you, Tom, to head over to the Slack workspace and see if there are any other questions there and interact with the guests. And also, if you're still tuned in, we encourage you to head on over there and enter into conversation with Tom about the governance of this great venture. Finally, I want to thank everyone for joining us today on the second day, and ask that you be aware that we have all of these conversations available for you to view on CWI's YouTube channel. So just do a search on YouTube for CWI or California Water Institute. You'll find us there. And join us tomorrow. We're going to have a panel discussion held by all of the key presenters from the summit, and you'll have a chance to ask questions and hear them speak some more on their topics. And so please continue to engage with us on Slack Space, and we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.